Hello there. Have you ever wondered if the wicked queen from Snow White was truly evil? Tonight, let's become the wicked queen and search for the truth together. You awaken in the body of the wicked queen. The first thing you feel is regret, coiled like a sleeping serpent at the base of your spine. The world sees you as the jealous queen, but reality is softer, lonelier, filled with years of silence and sorrow. Round you, the world flickers. You wake in a fog-laced tower, ivy-choked and hollow. The scent of damp stone and burnt lavender lingers. Beside you, a hand mirror with a silver frame, cracked like frost on glass. And within you, a name waiting to be remembered. So, before you drift into this tender darkness, remember to like and subscribe to Whisper Audio if you truly want to hear the forgotten tales I whisper here each night. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Now, dim the lights, let the soft winds hum around you, and let me take you to the tale never told. The mirror lied first. It told you that you were beautiful, but not just beautiful the most, as though beauty were a crown heavier than gold, as though it were a reason to be watched, weighed, and eventually replaced. You awaken to the sound of dripping stone. Moss clings to the corners of your chamber like memory. The fire in the hearth is long dead, but its ashes are stirred, as if something whispered through them in the night. Your hands are pale, not from age, but from forgetting to feel warmth. The rings once gifted to you on winter mornings by knights, suitors, diplomats still cling to your fingers, though their promises have rusted. You lift the mirror, the same one that spoke once, long ago. Now, its crack splits your left cheek like a scar. You do not ask it the question, not anymore. The silver has dulled with time, or perhaps with grief. The voice that lived within velvety, male, amused has long since gone silent. Mirrors do not speak to women who know themselves too well. Still, you remember the first time it did. You had been 17, the crown still too large, the robe dragging behind like a funeral train. You had stood in this very tower and whispered, half laughing, "Mirror, mirror on the wall," and it had answered, "Your Majesty, you are the fairest, for now." For now, you thought it a jest, until the girl arrived. But we are not there yet. Today, there is another memory stirring, a ritual. You walk barefoot across the cold stones to the little wooden chest beside your bed. Inside, a comb of carved bone, a vial of elderflower oil, and a velvet pouch of crushed herbs. Each morning you used to steep them in wine and sip it slowly, watching the light crawl over the hills. A beauty rite, yes, but also something older. Your mother's mother called it the keeping, for keeping the youth that grief would steal, for keeping the soul inside the body when mirrors tried to pull it out. You drink it again now. The taste is bitter wormwood and memory. You almost forget why you stopped. A name claws its way up your throat, but you swallow it. You think of that name every time you trace the mirror's edge, every time the servants avoid your gaze, every time the king's chamber door remains closed, though no footsteps lie behind it. There was a girl, not yours, but nearly. You could have loved her, should have, perhaps. But today, your reflection does not show her face. It only shows yours, tired, regal, slightly undone. You pull the black veil over your hair, not for mourning. No, that was months ago. You wear it now because it makes you harder to read. Because the people have begun to look at you with eyes that call you witch instead of queen. Once, you would have corrected them. Now, you almost prefer it. At least witches have agency. Queens are just stories waiting to be rewritten. In the village below, the bells toll faintly. A child has been born or buried, or both. You think of the girl's laugh, bright and unafraid. How it clanged against the stone walls of the court like sunlight in winter. How it made your courtiers forget to bow. The first time you saw her, you thought she looked like spring. But that's not until later, is it? Still, something inside you already trembles. You reach for the mirror again, press your thumb to its broken curve, and you whisper quietly to no one, was I ever the fairest, or only the most forgotten? Outside, the fog thickens. The mirror does not reply, not anymore. The crown did not fit, not metaphorically, physically. It slipped too far down your brow on the day of your coronation, and you had to tilt your head just so to keep it from falling. You remember the heat beneath your robes, the scent of wax and myrrh, and how the nobles bowed without looking at your face, not out of respect, out of fear. You were young, too young. The old king, your husband now, was already gray at the temples, and you had not yet buried your girlhood. He'd chosen you from across the sea for your lineage, your posture, your silence. You were the right kind of beautiful, obedient, remote, hollow. They called you a rose in winter, but no one asked where the thorns had gone. The crown was heavy with other women's sins. Wives who had not borne sons, queens who had smiled too wide, steve-mothers, witches, daughters-in-law, all vanished beneath the same titles. You were told that power would keep you safe. Instead, it kept you still. At the coronation feast, the meat was undercooked, an ill omen, some whispered. Your wine tasted of iron. The king's hand was firm, but not cruel, resting on your shoulder like ownership. You smiled until your cheeks ached. You danced. You bled. Your mother's locket lay cold against your chest. You never saw your homeland. Again, years passed, not many but enough. You learned the court's little cruelties. The way men praised your beauty, but never your mind. The way they softened their insults with your grace. The way the king stopped asking you to speak, unless you were repeating something he'd said. One winter, he gifted you a child not yours, but his, left to your care while his own mother withered of some mountain illness. The girl had eyes like river stones and lips red as fresh bruises. The court fell in love with her laughter. You did not at first. You made sure she was fed, clothed, educated in the old rites and the new ones. But you did not hold her, you did not sing to her, and when she cried, it was not your name she called. Still, something softened. You remember the first time she handed you a flower she'd picked, a violet crushed between her fingers. You took it with gloved hands and said nothing. But that night, you pressed it between the pages of your mother's book of herbs. It is still there. You dream of it sometimes. Now, in this tower, you light a candle. Tonight is the feast of the hollow moon, an old rite, nearly forgotten. Once, the women of the court would anoint their temples with ash and speak the names of the women who had been erased. You perform it alone now, a smear of soot across your brow, a whisper into the cold. Leora, your mother's name. Marin, the queen before you, who bled for 7 winters and bore no heir. Selene, the girl's mother, whose memory still clings to the childlike perfume. You do not say your own name. It doesn't feel like yours anymore. The mirror watches. You wonder what it sees, if it sees anything at all, or if it is just a glass cage, cracked and dull, waiting to catch your face in the wrong light. The court no longer visits you. They whisper of sorcery, of vanity, of spells. But they forget how many years you stayed silent, how many years you played the part. The crown still sits in its velvet box, untouched. You never tried it on again, because somewhere beneath all that gold and weight, you suspect it never truly belonged to you. And maybe, just maybe, it never belonged to any of them? Or was that the first betrayal? That you believed it would? She looked like spring. The first time you saw her in the garden, she was humming to herself, barefoot on the wet grass, clutching a basket too large for her arms. The air smelled of thawed soil and crushed mint. Her sleeves were rolled up, smudged with berry juice, her lips already stained with the color of temptation. You stood behind a curtain of ivy and watched. She did not know you were there, and even if she had, she would not have feared you. Not then. The garden had once belonged to queens, a sacred space, bordered by hedges carved into beasts and saints. You had let it grow wild again, a quiet rebellion. Now the roses climbed where they willed, and the vines tangled themselves like dreams too long denied. You used to walk there, before the whispers started, before the king's voice dried up and cracked against yours like brittle parchment, before the courtiers began to call her fairest in tones too sweet, too careful, too certain. But in that moment, watching her dance between the blooms, fingers grazing petals like blessings, you didn't see a threat. You saw possibility. A strange tenderness bloomed in you, like ache, like awe. But it didn't last. That same evening, a noblewoman complimented her eyes. The mirror's silence grew louder. The cook burned your supper and blamed it on the wind. Small things, barely noticed, and yet they grew. She began to mimic your voice, not out of mockery, but admiration. Her posture mirrored yours. She took your books from the library. She wore dark blue, your favorite color. You tried to smile at her across the supper table. She tried to sit closer. You could have loved her. There were nights when you almost did. When she laid her head in your lap and asked you about the stars, you told her stories from your homeland. She listened with wide eyes, hands curled around your wrist like it was a root. And she was afraid of drifting. She never called you mother. But once, in a half-sleeping whisper, she called you home. You remember that most of all. Still, even spring has shadows. You once found her in your chambers, standing too close to the mirror. Her fingers traced the crack. When she saw you, she jumped. "I just wanted to know if it would speak to me," she said. And for a moment so brief it may have been imagined you saw it. A flicker of gold in the glass. A twitch of something ancient, waiting. The fairest of them all. No voice, not yet. But you felt its hunger. That night, you locked the mirror away. You told her it was for protection, that the mirror was dangerous. She believed you. You almost believed it yourself. But the court believed something else. They began to call her princess, though no title had been given. The king, who had grown colder, stiffer, began to praise her openly. Your robes grew heavier, your voice softer, until you barely heard yourself speak. And then, once she wore your crown, not for ceremony, not for play, but because someone told her it was hers. You walked into the solar and found her before a mirror, holding it with both hands. She smiled at her reflection like someone seeing themselves for the first time. You said nothing. You simply turned and left. The next morning, the mirror awoke. Your Majesty, she is the fairest now. You felt it like a blade between your ribs. But the worst part wasn't the words. It was how relieved you felt to finally hear the truth spoken aloud. Because now, you could stop pretending it hadn't already happened. You could begin mourning what you'd never truly had. Or, had she always known? Had she waited, not in innocence but in quiet conquest? The basket, the garden, the crown, were they gifts or trophies? The apple was not poisoned, not in the way they said. It was an old recipe half forgotten, tucked in the back of your mother's grimoire. Dried yarrow for clarity, henbane for forgetting. A twist of nightshade not to kill, only to still. The rest was simple sweetness, cinnamon, clove, honey, pressed from your own hives. You made it by hand, in the old oven behind the kitchen garden, where no one watched you anymore. You ground each herb with a stone worn smooth by generations. Your sleeves rolled back. No rings, no crown. You tied your hair in a black ribbon, the same one you wore on the morning of your mother's funeral. It felt like something between prayer and penance. You remembered how she used to say, "A spell is just a grief that's been given a name." And yours, it had many. The child you were never meant to raise. The king who no longer asked for your counsel. The mirror, that pitiless witness. The girl, whose joy echoed in the halls like your own absence. But most of all, the version of you that still believed love could rewrite your story. You baked, in silence. The smell filled the ruined garden with something warm and wrong. You chose a single apple, deep red. No blemishes, a perfect lie. You did not practice what you would say. You did not rehearse a disguise. The truth was disguise enough. By then, no one looked at you directly. You found her alone. She had been sent to the outer cottages for safety, though no one said from whom. She was gathering herbs, hands full of rosemary and rue. A small, brave frown on her lips. She turned when she heard your steps. And this you remember clearly. She did not flinch. "What do you want?" she asked. You held out the apple. Her eyes fell to it, and in them, not fear, not confusion, recognition. She knew not just what the apple was, but what it meant. A soft end, a pause, a forgetting, and still she took it. Bit once, slowly, chewed, swallowed. For a moment, she smiled at you. You caught a glimpse of that day in the garden again. Her hair backlit by sun, her voice humming something you used to sing to yourself. Then her fingers slipped, the herbs fell, she crumpled into the wild flowers. You caught her before her head touched the ground. She was light, lighter than you expected. You brushed her hair from her cheek and whispered, "Sleep." No rage, no triumph, only ache. You carried her deeper into the woods, laid her on the bed of an abandoned shrine, once meant for forest saints. You lit candles from your own hearth. You wept, but only once she could not see. And still the stories changed. They said you poisoned her out of envy. They forgot how many nights you stayed awake to cool her fevers. How many times you tried to braid her hair, only to fail, and laugh together at your clumsy fingers. They forgot you could have killed her. But you didn't. You simply gave her stillness, the one gift no one else ever offered you. And perhaps that, too, was selfish. Or perhaps she wanted it. Perhaps she saw the weight of her own crown coming and chose rest instead. Perhaps they found her. Of course they did. You were not foolish enough to believe she would sleep forever. The forest whispered of her beauty, how the bloom never left her cheeks, how not even the smallest creature dared disturb her rest. They came, with gold and gods, with magic newer than yours, cleaner, brighter, with true names and truer loves. You were not there to see her awaken, but the mirror told you, its voice, quieter now, not cruel, just tired. She lives. You did not weep. Instead, you poured the last of your honey wine into a cracked goblet and walked barefoot through the snow-laced garden. The roses were long dead, the statues broken. Your fingers bled against the thorns you once let grow. She lived, and they would come for you. The prince of boy made of light and lies would arrive on a white steed, carrying justice in the hollow of his chest like a borrowed sword. He would not know you, not really, only the shape of your silhouette in cautionary tales. He would not ask why. None of them ever did. That night, you opened the old trunk beneath your bed and found what remained of your first dress, the one you wore the day you arrived a girl queen on a ship, wrists inked with salt and prayer. It no longer fit. You wrapped it around your shoulders like a shroud. There was no defense, no spell strong enough, no truth pure enough to pierce the fable they had already carved from your silence. So instead, you returned to the mirror. It had grown quiet since the day of the apple, not empty, watchful. You traced the crack with your finger. Was it ever me? You whispered. Was I ever the fairest, or just the most convenient? The mirror did not answer, but your reflection shifted. Not younger, not older, just honest. For a moment, you saw her standing behind you, not the girl, her, the one who wore the crown too early, the one who stood too still, who watched a child fall asleep in her lap and dared just once to believe it meant forgiveness. You could not touch her, but you nodded, and she nodded back. You prepared the room, not with weapons, with gentleness, candles in every corner, a bowl of figs and almonds, a shawl folded where the girl used to sit by the fire, your mother's book of herbs, left open to the page with the violet. You placed the crown not on your head, but on the windowsill, where the first light would catch it. When they came, you did not hide. You met them in the great hall, barefoot, draped in ash and memory. The prince looked at you like you were a riddle he had not been trained to answer. The girl stood behind him. Her eyes were softer, older. She stepped forward. The prince moved to stop her. She did not let him. Why? She asked. Not what, not how, just why. And you told her the truth. Not all of it. Not the old rights, or the broken promises, or how love sometimes curdles into protection. Just this. I wanted you to rest. She did not speak, but her hand trembled. She reached for the crown. You let her take it. It felt lighter in her hands. And perhaps that was your final spell. Or perhaps she had been carrying the weight all along. She did not return. Not that day. Not the next. Not ever. The castle grew colder after she left, though the hearth still burned. The servants walked softly, their eyes lowered. They whispered less, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of pity. You did not ask. You returned to the tower, not to hide, to remember. There was no trial, no exile, no mob. That would have required a villain bold enough to resist. But you simply stayed. Which was worse, in the end. A haunting needs no chains to echo. The mirror stopped speaking. You kept it anyway. You hung the crown above the lintel, not as decoration, but as warning, or perhaps as mourning. Some nights you stood beneath it and remembered the first time you wore it, how it slipped over your brow, too wide, like fate mismeasured. You do not wear black. You wear gray, storm gray, ash gray, the color between forgetting and forgiveness. On the last night of the harvest season, you baked again, not the apple never again, but a seed cake spiced with anise and nutmeg, soft in the center. It was the girl's favorite. You placed it in the garden, beneath the dead rosebush, and whispered the old names, Selene, Marin, Leora. You paused. Then, for the first time in years, you said your own, Isolda. It did not feel like forgiveness, but it felt true. One night, weeks or months or years later, it is hard to tell time in stories. You woke to laughter outside the window. Not cruel, not mocking, just young children chasing fireflies through the garden. You watched from the shadows as they danced past the roses, past the crumbling statues. One of them wore a blue ribbon in her hair, the same color you once favored. She stopped beneath your window, looked up and smiled, not in recognition, in wonder. You did not speak. You simply placed a hand against the glass. When she ran off, trailing light and joy, you turned back to your room, lit a candle, opened the herb book, and began to write your own name into the margins. Not as a queen, not as a witch, not as a villain, just as a woman who once tried to make sense of a world that only ever asked her to be silent. Outside, the wind hummed through the garden, gentle as breath, and somewhere, under the roots of forgotten trees, the villain still waits in silence. The fire has long since burned low. The castle sleeps again, and you no longer need to chase the reflection in the glass. You have seen the truth, not sharp, not final, but blurred like moonlight on river water. A life lived half in shadow, half in hope. Not every story ends with forgiveness, but perhaps this one ends with understanding, a quiet surrender, a name remembered, a love that never needed to be pure to be real. She is gone now, carved into legend, softened by time. The world will always choose the simplest ending, but in the still hours, some will wonder, some will light candles, place apples on altars, and whisper your name with care. Tonight, your hands are empty, but they are steady. No mirror, no crown, no child to lose again, only the hush of moss underfoot and the distant sound of a garden beginning to bloom. So close your eyes, rest now, and somewhere, under the roots of forgotten trees, the villain still waits in silence.